The champagne cork popped with a hollow echo through the marble foyer of the Blackwood estate, followed by laughter that didn't belong to his wife. Nathan Blackwood stood frozen in the doorway of his home office, phone pressed to his ear, his voice dropping to that particular register, warm, intimate, promising, that he reserved for conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. I'm telling you, Sienna, the view from the Maldives villa is insane. Private beach, infinity pool. Yeah, we could make that happen. Just give me a few more weeks to handle things here. He didn't notice the shadow that moved past the hallway behind him. Didn't see the woman with auburn hair and a 6-month pregnant belly pause at the threshold, her hand instinctively moving to protect the life growing inside her. Didn't register the exact moment Claire Blackwood heard the words that would dismantle 7 years of marriage. But he did notice 3 days later, when he came home to silence. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your chest and makes you understand, with animal certainty, that something fundamental has shifted in the architecture of your world. Claire? Nathan's voice echoed through rooms that had never felt empty before. His Italian leather briefcase hit the floor with a thud that seemed too loud. Claire? The kitchen was pristine. No dinner preparation, no notes on the marble counter where she always left them. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, his heart beginning to hammer with something that wasn't quite panic yet, more like the warning tremor before an earthquake. Their bedroom looked untouched. But when he opened her closet, his breath caught. Empty. Not completely. She'd left the designer dresses he'd bought her, the jewelry, the expensive shoes. Gone were the worn college sweatshirts she still slept in, the vintage books from her grandmother, the hand-knitted blanket from her sister. She'd taken the things that mattered, the things that were actually hers. On the bed, a single envelope. Nathan's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, no letter. Just copies of bank statements he'd never wanted her to see, showing regular transfers to an account under S. Morrison. And beneath those, printouts of text messages, months of them, that he'd been careless enough to leave synced to the iPad she sometimes borrowed. At the bottom, in Claire's precise handwriting, I'm not angry. I'm just done. Don't look for me. I'll have my lawyer contact you. That's when the panic truly hit. 3 months earlier, Claire had always been good at reading silences. Maybe it came from growing up in a house where her mother's moods shifted like weather patterns, where she'd learned to gauge the emotional temperature of a room before entering it. Or maybe it was just instinct, that particular feminine intuition that society loved to mock, but that had saved countless women from walking blindly into disasters. Either way, she'd felt the shift in Nathan 3 months ago, though she couldn't have articulated exactly what had changed. It was in the way he smiled at his phone now, a secret curve of his lips that disappeared the moment he noticed her watching. In how he'd suddenly become fastidious about his gym schedule, never missing a session, always coming home showered and cologne fresh. In the new attention he paid to his appearance, the expensive haircuts every 2 weeks instead of monthly, the switch from his usual cologne to something younger, more aggressive. You look beautiful tonight, Nathan had said last Tuesday, barely glancing up from his phone as she'd walked into their living room wearing a new maternity dress. She'd spent 20 minutes choosing it, another 30 doing her hair and makeup, hoping to surprise him. To remind him that she was still here, still the woman he'd married, even if her body was changing to accommodate their first child. Thank you, she'd replied, studying his face for any real warmth, any genuine appreciation. He'd smiled, that autopilot smile that people give when they're performing the social niceties, but their mind is elsewhere, and returned to his phone. That night, lying beside him in their California king bed, Claire had felt the loneliest she'd ever been in her life. More alone than during those college years when she'd worked 3 jobs to afford tuition. More isolated than the year after her father died, and she'd mourned without support because Nathan had been too busy with the acquisition to take time off. This was different. This was the loneliness of lying next to someone who used to be her person and realizing they'd become a stranger. She'd met Nathan Blackwood 7 years ago at a charity gala she'd been attending as a +1 for her friend Rachel. Claire had been 26, finishing her master's degree in literature, working part-time at a small publishing house and dreaming of becoming an editor. Nathan had been 32, already successful, the heir to his father's commercial real estate empire, but determined to prove he could exceed his legacy rather than just inherit it. He'd approached her at the bar with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but was softened by genuine curiosity in his eyes. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," he'd observed, signaling the bartender for 2 glasses of wine. "Is it that obvious?" She'd laughed, grateful for honest conversation in a room full of performative networking. "Only to someone who feels the same way. Nathan Blackwood." He'd extended his hand. "Claire Morrison." And why would Nathan Blackwood, whose family name is literally on the side of 3 buildings I can see from my apartment, want to be anywhere else? He'd grinned at that, a real smile that transformed his face from conventionally handsome to genuinely striking. "Because all anyone wants to talk about here is money, and who's making more of it. You're the first person tonight who looked at me like I might be interesting for some other reason." That had been the beginning. Their courtship had been intense, romantic, everything Claire had dreamed of. Nathan had pursued her with single-minded focus, showing up at her office with coffee, remembering small details she'd mentioned in passing, planning elaborate dates that made her feel cherished. When he'd proposed after 18 months, in front of her entire family at her mother's birthday party, she'd cried with happiness. The first few years of marriage had been good. Great, even. Nathan had encouraged her career, celebrating when she'd been promoted to senior editor. They'd traveled together, hosted dinner parties, talked for hours about their hopes for the future. He'd wanted children right away. She'd wanted to wait, to establish herself professionally first. They'd compromised, agreeing to try after 5 years. But somewhere in year 6, things had begun to shift. Nathan's business had exploded, a series of successful developments that tripled the company's value. With success came longer hours, more travel, less time for the small intimacies that had defined their relationship. Claire had tried to be understanding, had thrown herself into her own work, had told herself that this was just a season, and they'd find their way back to each other. When she'd gotten pregnant 6 months ago, she'd thought it would bring them closer. Thought the baby would remind Nathan of what really mattered, would recenter him. Instead, he'd seemed to drift further away. "I need to go to Singapore next week," he'd announced over breakfast 3 months ago, scrolling through his phone while she'd been trying to discuss nursery colors. "That's the week of my anatomy scan. You promised you'd be there." "Right, yes. Can we reschedule it?" "Nathan, it's a medical appointment. It's when we find out if the baby is healthy, if there are any." "I'm sure everything's fine. My assistant can arrange a different date." Still not looking up from his phone. That was when Claire had first felt it, the cold understanding that she was no longer a priority. That she and this baby were becoming obligations rather than joys. She'd gone to the anatomy scan alone. Had seen their daughter's profile on the ultrasound screen, had watched her tiny hand wave in the amniotic fluid, had felt love explode through her chest so powerful it was almost painful. And she'd realized, sitting in that darkened room with the ultrasound technician pointing out fingers and toes, that she would do whatever it took to protect this child. Even from her own father, if necessary. That's when she'd started paying attention. Really paying attention. The credit card statements that showed purchases at jewelry stores she'd received nothing from. The dinner reservations at restaurants they'd never visited together. The sudden password protection on his phone and laptop. The defensive anger when she asked simple questions about his day. And then, 2 weeks ago, the slip-up that confirmed what her gut had been screaming. "Who's Sienna?" she'd asked casually, noticing the name pop up on his phone screen before he'd snatched it away.
"What?"
"Oh, she works in property management for one of our buildings." "Why?" "She texts you a lot. Usually with heart emojis." The pause had been half a second too long. "She's just friendly. It's her communication style with everyone." Claire had nodded, said nothing, and that night, when Nathan was asleep, she'd used his fingerprint to unlock his phone. What she'd found had been worse than she'd imagined, but also oddly clarifying. Months of messages. Plans for getaways. Photos that made her stomach turn. But also, and this was what had sealed her decision, evidence of something calculated. Nathan wasn't just having an affair. He was planning a future that didn't include her. "Can't wait until this is all finalized," He texted Sienna 3 weeks ago. Lawyer says 6 more months, and I can file, without her getting half. Should have done a prenup, but who knew, right? You're terrible, Sienna had responded, with a laughing emoji. But I love it. We can finally stop hiding. Claire had read every message, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly, to the daughter who was swimming obliviously inside her. She'd felt something crystallize in her chest, not heartbreak, not rage, but something colder and clearer, resolution. She'd spent the next 3 days planning, not in anger, not in hurt, but with the systematic precision she'd brought to every major decision in her life. First, she'd called Daniel Reeves, the best divorce attorney in the state, someone Nathan had actually recommended during a friend's messy separation while saying, "Thank God we'll never need someone like that." "I need complete discretion," she told Daniel during their consultation in his downtown office. "My husband doesn't know I'm here, and I need to make sure my assets are protected before he knows I'm aware of the affair." Daniel, a sharp-eyed man in his 50s who'd seen every variation of marital betrayal, had nodded approvingly. Smart. Most people wait until emotions override strategy. What are we working with? Claire had laid out everything. Her own successful career as senior editor at Morrison Literary Press, ironically, still using her maiden name professionally. The trust fund from her grandmother that Nathan had never known about because she'd never mentioned it, a habit from her childhood of keeping resources hidden from her volatile mother. The documentation of Nathan's affair, his financial maneuvering, his obvious preparation for a divorce where he'd minimize her settlement. "He thinks I'm naive," Claire had said, surprised by how calm her voice sounded. "He thinks because I'm pregnant and emotional that I won't see this coming. He's wrong." "Do you want to try to save the marriage?" Daniel had asked, pen poised over his legal pad. Claire had thought about the man she'd married, the man who'd once stayed up all night with her when her father died, holding her while she cried. The man who'd surprised her with a first edition of her favorite book for her birthday. The man who'd promised her forever in front of everyone they loved. Then she'd thought about the man he'd become. The one who couldn't be bothered to attend their daughter's ultrasound. Who lied with increasing ease. Who was planning to discard her like she was a failed business venture. "No," she'd said. "I want to disappear before he even knows I'm gone." Daniel had smiled then, a small, satisfied expression that suggested he'd been hoping she'd say exactly that. "Then let's make sure you vanish like smoke." The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Claire had transferred her grandmother's trust fund money, $850,000 that Nathan had never known existed, into a new account at a different bank. She'd contacted her sister Emma in Portland, who'd immediately offered her guest house without asking questions. She'd arranged for a leave of absence from work, citing pregnancy complications. She'd boxed up the things that mattered, photo albums from before Nathan, her grandmother's jewelry, her most treasured books, and shipped them to Emma's address. And she'd waited for the perfect moment. It came on a Tuesday evening. Nathan was on the phone in his office, door half closed, his voice carrying that intimate warmth that used to be reserved for her. "I'm telling you, Sienna, the view from the Maldives villa is insane. Private beach, infinity pool. Yeah, we could make that happen. Just give me a few more weeks to handle things here." Claire stood in the hallway, one hand on her belly, feeling their daughter kick, as if in solidarity. She didn't feel anger, didn't feel betrayal. Felt instead a strange sense of liberation, like a knot she'd been tied in for months was finally loosening. She walked upstairs, packed her final bag, and left her wedding ring on the bathroom counter next to his cologne. The envelope with the bank statements and text messages, she left that on the bed, wanting him to find it after she was gone. Wanting him to understand that she knew, that she'd always known. Her Uber arrived at 9 p.m. She took one last look at the house they'd built together, at the life she was leaving behind, and felt nothing but relief. "Airport?" the driver asked. "Yes. And could you please turn up the music?" "Something happy." As they pulled away, Claire saw Nathan silhouetted in his office window, phone still pressed to his ear, completely unaware that his wife of 7 years was disappearing from his life. She smiled. 2 weeks later. Nathan Blackwood had never experienced real panic before. He'd closed multi-million-dollar deals under pressure, had negotiated with hostile developers and demanding investors, had weathered market crashes and economic downturns with steady nerves and calculated risk-taking. But this, coming home to an empty house, finding Claire gone without warning, realizing she knew everything, this was different. This was personal. This was loss. The first 48 hours had been chaos. He'd called everyone, her mother, her sister, her friends from work. No one claimed to know where she was, though he'd heard the accusation in their voices, the satisfaction in their refusal to help him. He'd hired a private investigator who'd traced her to a Portland address, her sister Emma's place. He'd shown up unannounced, pounding on the door of the main house with increasing desperation. Emma had opened the door with her arms crossed and an expression of pure contempt. "She doesn't want to see you. Emma, please. I just need to talk to her." To explain. Explain what, Nathan? The affair? The texts about waiting to divorce her so she gets less money? The fact that you've been treating my sister like an inconvenience while she's carrying your child? He'd flinched at the directness of it. It's not. It's more complicated than that. No, it really isn't. You fell in love with someone else, and instead of being honest, you were a coward. And now you don't get access to Claire just because you've decided you want it. I need to see her. To apologize. Emma, I made mistakes, but we can fix this. We have history, a baby coming. You should have thought of that before you started planning your exit strategy. Emma had started to close the door. Wait. His hand shot out, stopping it. Just tell her I came. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I'll do anything. Emma had looked at him with something like pity. You know what she said when she got here? She said she felt light. Said it was the first time in months she could breathe. You really want to take that away from her just to ease your guilt? She'd shut the door in his face. Nathan had stood there on the porch of a house in Portland suburbs, a house he'd never been to before because he'd always been too busy when Claire suggested visiting her sister, and felt the full weight of what he'd lost crash over him. Not the marriage, not really. If he was honest, he'd checked out of that months ago, caught up in the intoxication of new attraction, the ego boost of being desired by someone younger, the excitement of something fresh and uncomplicated. No. What crushed him was the realization that Claire had left with grace, had vanished without drama or confrontation, had simply decided he wasn't worth the fight. That hurt worse than if she'd screamed at him, thrown things, demanded answers. Her quiet exit was the ultimate dismissal. It said, "You don't matter enough to rage at. You're not worth my energy." He'd driven to a hotel, couldn't face going back to that empty house, and that night, sitting alone with a whiskey he couldn't taste, he'd pulled out his phone. The text thread with Sienna stared back at him. Hundreds of messages that had seemed exciting, forbidden, electric. Now they just looked hollow. Performative. Like he'd been playing a role rather than actually feeling anything real. When had it started? He tried to trace the timeline, to find the exact moment he decided that 7 years of marriage were disposable. It had been at that conference in Miami. 10 months ago. He'd been at the hotel bar after a particularly successful presentation, riding high on adrenaline and too many compliments, when Sienna Morrison had approached him. She'd been beautiful in that specific way that made men stupid. Young, confident, impressed by his success. They'd talked for hours. She'd laughed at all his stories, had been fascinated by his work, had made him feel like the most interesting person in the room. And he'd been weak enough to be flattered by it. The affair had started that night. What began as a one-time thing had spiraled into something ongoing, something that had required increasing levels of deception to maintain. And somewhere in the middle of juggling two women, two versions of himself, he'd convinced himself that what he felt for Sienna was real, and what he had with Claire was just routine. But now, sitting in this generic hotel room, he couldn't remember half of what he and Sienna had talked about in those countless messages. Couldn't recall what had been so captivating that he'd been willing to risk everything. What he could remember, with painful clarity, was the look on Claire's face the last time he'd really seen her. Not the morning she'd left, he hadn't even noticed her that day. But 3 weeks before that, when she'd asked if he wanted to feel the baby kick and he'd waved her off because he was on an important call. She'd looked at him with such profound sadness. Not anger, not hurt, just this deep, resigned sorrow that said she'd already begun grieving their marriage. And he'd been too caught up in his own bullshit to notice. His phone buzzed. Sienna. Hey, stranger. Haven't heard from you in a few days. Everything okay? Nathan stared at the message, thinking about how simple it would be to respond. To continue down this path he'd chosen. To finalize the divorce and start over with someone new, someone uncomplicated, someone who didn't know all his flaws and failures. Instead, he typed, My wife left me. She knows everything. I think I made the biggest mistake of my life. The response came quickly. Oh my God. Do you need me to come over? And that's when Nathan understood the fundamental difference. Sienna was offering to come over because the drama excited her. Because she wanted to be part of the story, wanted to play the role of the new woman who comforts the devastated man, who proves she's better than the wife. Claire would have asked, Are you okay? First. Would have put his pain before the narrative. That was the difference between someone who loved the idea of you and someone who actually loved you. He'd thrown away the second for the first. The next morning, Nathan showed up at Emma's house again. This time, Claire was standing on the porch of the guest house, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, watching him approach with an expression of such composure it made him feel like a child. Claire. Don't. Her voice was quiet but firm. I don't want apologies or explanations. I didn't agree to see you for that. Then why? Because Daniel said we should discuss the divorce terms in person. He's inside. She gestured toward the main house. Nathan felt his stomach drop. Already? You've already filed? Yes. 3 days after I left. I wasn't going to wait around while you figured out how to minimize my settlement, Nathan. I read your messages, remember? I know you were planning to wait until you could file and reduce what I get. So I did it first. He'd forgotten about that. Had forgotten she'd seen everything. I wasn't, that was just, don't lie. She said it without emotion, like she was commenting on the weather. We're past that now. The only thing I need from you is to sign the papers and co-parent our daughter civilly. Can you do that? Looking at her standing there, strong, self-possessed, 7 months pregnant with his child, and somehow more beautiful than he'd ever seen her, Nathan felt the full magnitude of his loss. This wasn't just about ending a marriage. It was about losing his best friend. The person who'd known him before the money and success had changed him. The woman who'd loved him when he was still figuring out who he wanted to be. And he'd traded her for someone who loved what he represented, not who he actually was. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. Claire, I'm so goddamn sorry. I was an idiot. I was selfish and stupid, and I threw away the best thing in my life because I was too much of a coward to appreciate what I had. She watched him with those clear, steady eyes. I know. Is there any chance we could? No. Simple. Final. That person you married? She doesn't exist anymore. You broke her. I spent the last 3 months becoming someone new. Someone who doesn't need you to feel whole. I could change. I could. Nathan. She sighed, and for the first time, he heard weariness in her voice. I don't want you to change. I want you to be happy. Just not with me. Not anymore. Daniel Reeves appeared on the porch of the main house, briefcase in hand. Mr. Blackwood, shall we handle this professionally? What followed was 2 hours of the most humiliating experience of Nathan's life. Claire's demands weren't vengeful or excessive. They were simply fair. She wanted her share of their joint assets, child support, shared custody with reasonable visitation, and for Nathan to cover all pregnancy and birth-related medical costs. What devastated him was realizing she'd been prepared for this, while he'd been completely blindsided. She'd documented everything, had protected her assets, had moved with strategic precision while he'd been stumbling around in an affair that meant nothing. I'm not signing anything until I've had my attorney review it, Nathan had said, a last desperate attempt at control. Claire had simply nodded. That's fine. Take your time. But understand that the longer this drags out, the more it costs us both. And our daughter deserves better than parents who are fighting over money. She'd stood then, moving with the careful grace of late pregnancy, and looked at him one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for, Nathan. I really do. I hope Sienna makes you happy. I hope you build something real with her. But I also hope you understand that what we had wasn't something to discard. It was worth fighting for. You just decided it wasn't worth the effort. And then she'd walked away, back to the guest house, back to her new life that didn't include him. Nathan had sat in his car for 20 minutes afterward, forehead against the steering wheel, feeling something crack open in his chest that he couldn't name. 6 months later, the courtroom was smaller than Nathan had expected, less dramatic than television had led him to believe. He sat beside his attorney, not Daniel Reeves, but the second-best divorce lawyer in the state, which felt like a metaphor for his entire situation, and watched Claire enter with her sister Emma beside her. She was beautiful, even exhausted from new motherhood, even in simple clothes with her hair pulled back, even looking at him with complete neutrality. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. All rise. The proceedings were quick, professional, bloodless. The judge reviewed the settlement they'd agreed upon, asked the standard questions, confirmed they both understood the terms. Mr. Blackwood, do you agree to the custody arrangement outlined in Section 14? Yes, Your Honor. And you understand this grants you every other weekend and alternating holidays, with adjustments to be made as the child grows older? I understand. The judge signed the papers with decisive strokes. Then, by the power vested in me by the state, I hereby grant this dissolution of marriage. Congratulations on your new daughter, and I hope you're both able to co-parent successfully. Just like that, 7 years of marriage ended with a gavel strike. Outside the courthouse, Claire was buckling an infant carrier into Emma's car. Nathan approached slowly, afraid of being dismissed again. Claire? Could I meet her? She paused, considering, then nodded. You can hold her if you want. Nathan approached the car seat where his 3-week-old daughter lay sleeping. She was impossibly tiny, with Claire's auburn hair and his nose. His hands trembled as he unbuckled her, carefully lifting her out. The moment she settled against his chest, something fundamental shifted in his understanding of the universe. This was his daughter, his child. This tiny, perfect human who existed because he and Claire had once loved each other enough to create life together. And he'd almost missed everything that led to her. Almost destroyed the foundation she'd be built on because he'd been too selfish to appreciate what he had. Her name is Grace, Claire said quietly. Grace Elizabeth Blackwood. It's perfect. His voice cracked. She's perfect. Claire, I don't. She held up a hand. We're not doing this here. We're co-parents now. That's all. And that's enough. Is it? He looked at her over their daughter's head. Because I've spent 6 months realizing that what I had with you was everything, and what I thought I wanted was nothing. I ended things with Sienna 2 days after you left. Haven't seen her since. Because the entire time, all I could think about was how I destroyed the only real thing I ever had. Claire's expression didn't change. I'm glad you learned something from this, Nathan. I really am. But your growth doesn't erase what you did. It doesn't change the fact that you made me feel worthless while I was carrying your child. It doesn't give us back the time you wasted or the trust you shattered. I know. But people make mistakes. People change. We had 7 years of good before 1 year of bad. And that one bad year showed me who you really were when things got hard. Showed me that when you felt bored or restless, you didn't turn toward me. You turned away. She took Grace from his arms with practiced ease. I deserve someone who turns toward me, Nathan. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Emma opened the car door, giving Nathan a look that was marginally less hostile than before but still clearly protective of her sister. Will you? Nathan swallowed hard. Will you let me be part of her life? Really part of it, not just court-ordered visits. Claire secured Grace in the car seat, then turned back to him. That's up to you. Show up consistently. Be reliable. Don't make promises you can't keep. Do that, And yes, you can be as involved as you want to be. But Nathan? Don't do it to win me back. Do it because she deserves a father who's present. She deserves better than I've been. You both do. For the first time, he saw something soften in Claire's expression. Not forgiveness. Nothing that generous. But maybe understanding. Recognition that he was, finally, seeing clearly. Then be better, she said simply. Not for me. For her. They drove away, leaving Nathan standing outside the courthouse, divorce papers in hand, watching the taillights disappear around a corner. He thought about the last 6 months. The way he'd felt when he'd realized Claire was gone. The hollow shock of understanding that Sienna had been a fantasy, not a future. The slow, painful process of acknowledging that he'd sabotaged the best relationship of his life because he'd been too cowardly to do the work when things got routine. His phone buzzed. A message from his business partner. Close the Singapore deal. Drinks tonight? Nathan looked at the message, then at the courthouse behind him, then at the street where his daughter had just disappeared. For the first time in his life, the business deal felt less important than everything else. He texted back. Can't tonight. Have some things I need to take care of. Then he called his assistant. Clear my schedule for tomorrow. I need to look at apartments. Apartments, sir?
Yeah.
Something in Portland. Close to Laurelhurst Park. 2 bedrooms, so Grace can have her own room when she visits. Because if he was going to be a father, really be a father, he needed to be where his daughter was. Needed to stop treating parenting as something that happened on a court-ordered schedule and start treating it as the most important job of his life. It wouldn't win Claire back. He understood that now. The woman he'd married was gone, transformed by his betrayal into someone stronger, someone who'd learned to value herself more than any marriage. But maybe, if he showed up every single day, if he proved through consistent action rather than empty words that he'd learned something from losing everything, maybe his daughter wouldn't grow up thinking that men abandon the people they were supposed to protect. Maybe he could break that cycle. Maybe he could, finally, become someone worthy of the grace he'd been given but hadn't appreciated until it was too late. 1 year later. The park was crowded with families enjoying the late summer afternoon. Nathan sat on a bench, watching Grace toddle through the grass with the determined concentration of a 15-month-old who just discovered the joy of walking. Careful, sweet girl, he called out, ready to spring up if she wobbled too much. She's doing great. Nathan turned to find Claire approaching, iced coffee in each hand. She offered him one, his regular order, because even after everything, she still remembered. Thanks. He accepted it, surprised. In the year since their divorce finalized, their interactions had been cordial but distant. She was never cold, but never warm either. Polite co-parents. Nothing more. You've been really consistent, Claire said, settling on the bench beside him. Every weekend, every holiday. Emma said you moved up here permanently. 6 months ago. Got a place near the park. Opened a Portland office so I could run things from here instead of commuting. Made sense. This is where Grace is. That's really good, Nathan. She's lucky to have you so involved. He watched their daughter investigate a dandelion with serious focus. I missed 3 months of her life because I was too busy destroying my marriage. I don't plan to miss anything else. They sat in silence for a moment, watching Grace together. I heard Sienna got engaged, Claire said finally, to some tech executive. Congratulations, by the way. Nathan laughed, a real, genuine laugh. You're congratulating me on my ex-mistress marrying someone else? Well, you ended things with her, right? So technically she's your ex. And it means she's definitely moved on, which means you can too. I did move on. Just not in the direction I expected. Claire glanced at him, curious. I started therapy, he admitted, after you left. Wanted to understand why I sabotaged everything. Turns out I have this whole pattern of running when things get real, when relationships require actual work instead of just romantic gestures. And I'm working on it. Learning that being uncomfortable isn't the same as being wrong. That routine isn't the same as being dead. That sometimes the hardest work is staying rather than leaving. Grace toddled over, arms raised, wanting to be picked up. Nathan scooped her up, and she immediately grabbed his nose, giggling. Dada. His heart melted, like it did every single time she said that word. You're a good father, Claire said quietly. I mean that. I watch you with her, and I see someone who's really present, who's really trying. I wish I'd been that person sooner. Wish I'd been that person when it could have mattered. She was quiet for a long moment. It does matter, Nathan. Maybe not in the way you want, but it matters. It matters to Grace. It matters that she's seeing you choose her every day. What about you? He turned to face her. Are you happy? Claire considered the question seriously. Yeah, I actually am. I've got Grace, I've got my work, just got promoted to executive editor, actually. I've got my sister close by. I've got a life that feels like mine instead of something I'm performing for someone else. Anyone new? She smiled slightly. Would it bother you if there was? Probably. But that's my problem, not yours. There's no one serious. I've been on a few dates. Nothing that stuck. Mostly I'm just focused on being a mom and remembering who I am outside of being someone's wife. Grace started squirming, wanting down. Nathan set her back on the grass and watched her immediately begin investigating a stick. I know I don't get to ask this, he said. And I know the answer is probably no. But is there any chance, any universe where we could? Nathan. Her voice was gentle but firm. What we had was real. It was good for a long time. But you broke something fundamental, and I can't go backward to who I was before. I don't want to. I'm not asking you to go backward. I'm asking if we could build something new. Something better. I'm not the same person I was a year ago, and neither are you, and maybe nothing. She turned to face him fully. Nathan, you hurt me. You made me feel small and stupid and disposable. And the worst part is, you did it while I was pregnant, during one of the most vulnerable times of my life. Do you understand how deep that cut? How completely it changed the way I see you? He felt the words like physical blows, but forced himself to hear them. I do. I hate that I did that to you. I hate who I was. Being sorry doesn't mean we get a second chance. Life doesn't work that way. But sometimes people do change. Sometimes they learn and grow and become better versions of themselves. They do, Claire agreed. And I'm genuinely glad you're doing that work. But your growth doesn't obligate me to give you another shot. I spent months rebuilding myself after you shattered my confidence. I'm not going to risk that again. Grace fell on her bottom, looked surprised, then started to cry. Both parents moved simultaneously, but Claire got there first, scooping her up and murmuring comfort. Watching them together, his daughter and his ex-wife, Nathan felt the strange dual sensation of profound loss and profound gratitude. He'd destroyed something precious, but from that destruction had come this, a woman who knew her worth, a daughter who was loved fiercely, and his own painful but necessary evolution. Will you at least think about it? He asked, knowing he shouldn't push, but unable to help himself. Not now, maybe not even soon, but eventually? The possibility of us trying again? Claire rocked Grace gently, considering. You know what I learned this year, Nathan? I learned that I don't need someone to complete me. I'm whole on my own. I learned that being alone is better than being with someone who makes me feel lonely. And I learned that I deserve someone who chooses me even when it's hard, even when it's boring, even when there are other options. I choose you. I've chosen you every day since you left. You chose me after you lost me. That's not the same thing. The truth of that hit him squarely in the chest. You're right, he admitted. You're absolutely right. I didn't appreciate what I had until it was gone. That's on me. That's my failure. It is, she agreed, not unkindly. But Nathan, the fact that you can admit that you're not making excuses or playing victim, that's growth. That's real. And maybe someday, that growth will make you the right partner for someone. Just probably not me. She handed Grace back to him. Your weekend starts in an hour. I'll have her bag ready. He held his daughter close, breathing in her baby shampoo smell, feeling her warm weight against his chest. Thank you. For letting me be her dad. for not shutting me out even though I deserved it. Grace deserves a father who shows up. I would never take that from her, no matter what you did to me. She stood, brushing grass from her jeans. See you Sunday night? Sunday night, he confirmed. He watched her walk away across the park, her auburn hair catching the sunlight, and felt the complex tangle of regret, loss, and acceptance settle in his chest. He'd made choices that cost him everything, had learned the hardest possible lesson about taking people for granted. But from that pain had come something unexpected. Not redemption, exactly, but maybe the beginning of wisdom. The understanding that some mistakes can't be fixed, only learned from. Grace patted his face with her tiny hand. Dada. Yeah, baby girl. I'm here. I'm always going to be here.
And he meant it.
Not as a strategy to win back Claire. Not as penance for his mistakes. But because sitting in a park on a summer afternoon, holding his daughter, accepting responsibility for his failures while trying to build something better, this was the only path forward that made any sense. He'd lost his wife. But he'd found something he'd been missing his whole life. The understanding that showing up was more important than grand gestures. That consistency mattered more than intensity. That real love wasn't the easy beginning but the hard middle, and he'd failed that test spectacularly. But he wouldn't fail Grace. Wouldn't let his daughter grow up thinking that men left when things got complicated. Some mistakes couldn't be unmade. Some damage couldn't be repaired. But some lessons learned too late could still shape everything that came after. Nathan stood, Grace secure in his arms, and headed toward his car. He had a weekend with his daughter ahead of him. Diaper changes and bottle feedings and the delicate, difficult, beautiful work of being present. It wasn't the life he'd imagined a year ago. But it was real. It was earned. It was his. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Behind him, Claire watched from across the park, her hand resting briefly over her heart before she turned away, moving forward into a future she was building, brick by brick, on her own terms. The quiet exit had changed everything, and neither of them would ever be the same.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.